Welcome. This is Parenting Through Trauma. I am Maureen O'Neill Davis. I'm your host. I'm also co founder of Family Forward Advocacy Connecticut, also known as FACT. FACT is a parent and policy advocacy organization formed by parents for parents, raising kids impacted by early trauma, adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, and parents who experience child welfare and child serving systems such as special education, children's behavioral health care, etc. We focus on supporting family integrity and raising awareness on the impact of early trauma on kids and the experience of their nurturing, devoted parents to get them help and services. Today, we are talking about trends in child welfare and activism leading to change with my guest, Connie Reguli. Connie is a well known child protection defense attorney and a child welfare reform advocate. She practices in Tennessee, but she informs and inspires parents all across the country to know their rights and raise their voices around the right to parent. Connie, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. So good to be with you.
Before we get started, I just wanted to be transparent here. In full disclosure, Family Forward Advocacy Connecticut does operate as a chapter of Family Forward Foundation, which is a Tennessee nonprofit you formed a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
And can you tell us a little bit briefly about what Family Forward Foundation is doing and how it works with the Family Forward Network, which I see obviously on Facebook a lot?
Absolutely. So, yes, I am an attorney. I practiced for many years. I have just noticed that there were a lot of problems just in the general family policy issue, whether it was through the divorce court or the DCS or whatever. So, as I began to really kind of focus what I wanted to help improve in the system, it really focused on the child welfare part of it because of the state intervention. And when the state gets involved, it seems like parents cannot get out of it. I started through social media, I think in about 2015. It's when several of us through social media went up to Washington, D.C. for one of the first times we were able to begin to meet each other face to face. And what I had noticed at that point, it was kind of, we were really just kind of lucky to sort of catch each other or find out something. And so I did set up through Facebook the group a Family Forward project just to be able to invite parents in or other people with an interest so people could tell their own stories, so we could share the news events that were going on specifically for child welfare, so we could share what changes we saw in the law, and we just kind of have that platform to do it. It is Family Forward project is not really organized as an entity at this point. I also created the Family Forward project page, and those who sort of understand Facebook formatting, of course, you use groups and pages a little bit differently. And then after meeting you and some other really great advocates who really just wanted to just start making proactive steps and kind of hone in on our focus, we developed the 501c3 of the Family Forward Foundation, which does have a website, which is familyforwardfoundation.com right now. Our mission statement is on there. And it's really, we're starting to look at setting up different regions so that we can have 3 or 4 states join together, because it's so important that we watch what's happening in every state. So we use that. And then also I just use my own presence through YouTube. I do a lot of videos that I either do through a Facebook Live and then upload them to YouTube, or sometimes I just see very interesting things that I clip videos, put them on YouTube, just to kind of keep this narrative about child welfare going on. I've also found that my YouTube channel has been a very good way to access people who are not directly related to our Facebook groups, because I do tag everything, either CPS correction, CPS reform, child welfare reform, they took my kids, so that people just in searching will come up with some of those videos. And I have had people call me, new people, and ask me to become involved in their child welfare case just because of that. So it's a matter of just getting the story and the narrative out there.
Well, and I noticed the Family Forward Project group on Facebook has well over 15,000 members at this point. And when I met you 4 years ago or so, we started with less than 1,000 in those first couple of months. And so it's really grown over these
Right.
4 or 5 years.
Well, and also I think Facebook limits you because I know at one point we were up to 15,000 and Facebook just automatically deleted like 3,000 people. So we built back up to 15,000, but I have a feeling that we sort of get limited. Facebook kind of limits us. What we hope to do at some point, of course, is create some type of a membership through the Family Forward Foundation, partly so that we can get maybe a token membership fee on a monthly or annual basis so that we have a little bit more financial support for some of the things that we do in our advocacy work, and even to actually employ our time more full time because everybody has to have some kind of income and living. And so I think with what I do, with what you do, with just really a handful of other advocates across this United States, where they're just on top of it. I mean, they're watching their state legislators, they're watching the federal legislation, they're willing to show up, they're willing to lobby. So, we've got to look at it now. I mean, honestly, much like the NRA, right? I mean, we need to organize and have staff and have lobbying efforts that get our bills appropriate to the appropriate places.
Well, and here in Connecticut, the Sandy Hook Promise is another example of a group of parents who obviously face adversity and really horrible situation and have risen to generating revenue by way of donations and support and really making change both at the state level and at the federal level. And I know our mission is rooted in that same premise. So today we're going to be talking about trends in child welfare, which intertwine with children's behavioral health, which impacts special education, which impacts families, and which traumatizes children, as well as parents. And so briefly, can you just give our listeners an idea of what it was that got you into child welfare defense law so many years ago?
Well, I'm going to give the really short version of that so we can get
Please.
more up to date. But
Yes.
Law was a second career for me. I actually said I had a real world experience before I became a lawyer, which I think is very good. So, but when I became a lawyer, I really thought that, it was about truth and justice. And wasn't too long after I started getting involved with government tactics that I found out that it was a lot of manipulation and abuse of the taxpayer dollars. And a big part of that is the hostage that they hold families once they become in the child welfare system. I mean, and I saw it as early as 1996, 1997, when I was first really just putting my feet on the ground. And it actually was a dizzying experience because it seemed like you could never really totally make sense of it. And so I just, created a passion for it because I saw so many people hurt. And then as I started to reach out and really kind of look at where I fit the need and where I could help families, it's not just a matter of litigating, but it's also educating. It's also supporting, encouraging, just kind of giving them direction in that process so they don't get stuck in it. One of my big grievances about the system is it is supposed to be about the best interest of the child, but it's actually a very adversarial system. And so you cannot truly serve the needs of the family and the child when everything is a contest. I mean, everything is a contest. I was just on a phone meeting this morning, and it's like just trying to determine what it takes to get a child, a baby back in their home. You can't even get a straight answer. It's like, well, we're going to have to go to court and litigate it. It's like, we just want to know what will satisfy you to say that this is a safe home, and we can't get a straight answer. So part of this really litigious, contested place is not the right place for family and children. Before I became a lawyer, I did my master's program in social psychology, group dynamics, et cetera. And so I really kind of look at this as a more systemic issue and problem that we need to start addressing. And so I'm not sure if that really totally answered the question because it's kind of complex, but it's really taken that legal knowledge and my social psychology knowledge and really just looking at a broken system and saying, we've got to do better as a country.
Well, and I think a lot of people who have not had the, we'll call it an opportunity, but it's really this anguishing experience in being involved with a child welfare case. The general consensus is that child welfare functions well. Our tax dollars are doing what they need to do and you must have done something to have been brought to the attention of your local child welfare agency. And so, who is that person on the outside to judge the system? You must have done something to warrant their involvement. So based on that, what have you seen over the course of your years? What's the trend now that has changed and is affecting families in ways that is really not valuable, traumatizing the very kids that they're trying to help and support, and certainly traumatizing their families as well? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So, and I'm really glad you said that, Maureen, because the statistics that are publicly available, and of course, I know people don't go look for these statistics on a daily basis, but the statistics that are published by our government shows that of the 687,000 children in the custody of the government are there because of neglect. So, like, I think the stat is 85% of them are there under what's termed neglect. It is not physical or sexual abuse. So I'm glad you said that, because people think, oh, you must have hurt your child, you must have abused your child. But the statistics show nationwide it's neglect. And so then you have to say, okay, so what is neglect? Because we're all going to agree that if you're putting your child in cages, or you're beating them, or you're sexually abusing them, that the child needs to be safe and the child needs to be away from that situation. There is no dispute about that. But then we have to say, what is neglect, and how is it defined? How is it remedied? What is the effect on the child? And it's a very amorphous category. We know that about half of the neglect, there's some substance abuse, usually by the parent. Sometimes it's a child, like a teenage child, perhaps, but about half of that. So you're looking at about 40% of the children end up in the system because there's some parental substance abuse. Again, that can be anything from smoking a joint once a week to a heavy meth addict, or somebody using fentanyl illegally. Okay, so it's not a very well assessed area. The other 40% under this neglect is very hard to define. It can be disagreements with education. It can be children who have disabilities, okay? Children who are autistic or have even Down syndrome, or have other type of trauma in their background, that it causes a dysfunction in the family, and the family has limited resources because we don't have really good resources for those. It can be medical, what I call medical kidnapping. It can be disagreements with medical diagnosis. One of the very sad things that we're dealing with right now is a trend of babies and infants who have metabolic bone disease that is not properly diagnosed. And these babies get multiple rib fractures over a course of time. And they're all different times. And yet the Department of Children's Services will come in and say that you crush that baby with your hands, instead of really looking at a situation where just handling a child, picking them up by their ribs, can cause different fractions of different bones. It's much like an old person who breaks their hip and falls, right? They don't fall and break their hip, they break their hip and falls. So you have these people telling that story to people. It can be poverty. It can be disabled parents. I've had cases where I've had parents with a disability who end up on a limited income. So now, under this category of neglect, we also have what I consider medical kidnapping, which can be a misdiagnosis, can be a disagreement with diagnosis. We have this epidemic of little tiny infants, especially if there's anything that kind of puts them in a certain category, which could be prematurity, vitamin D deficiency, children who have
Okay, Connie, so sorry for that interruption. Let's move on real quick to the term neglect, and the fact that we know that neglect is used for a lot of cases that are brought up against families, but the term neglect is really not well defined or universally defined. Can you talk about that real quick?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. So we have basically 40% of the children that are removed and put into care, according to national statistics, fall into this category of neglect. And I've actually contested this before, because the definition used to be for neglect, a child who is suffering from neglect. However, they've changed it somewhat and they've tried to add some other words to it, but it's truly not well defined. And so it can be parents with children with disabilities. It can be disabilities with the parents. It can be differences in medical diagnosis. It can be refusals to get vaccines. It can be educational questions. So there's a whole variety of things that really don't have tight parameters for which you can lose your children to the state.
Yeah, and I know from my personal experience and from the experience of a lot of the families we are working with here in Connecticut, this is happening quite a bit. Publicly, there is a suggestion of a trend to keep more kids with their families, and the Family First Prevention Services Act legislation that we helped get through at the federal level is beginning to make an impact. We're seeing it here in Connecticut in terms of the discussions, but we're certainly not seeing it yet in terms of practice and policies and action. And my hope is that it is coming. And with that, perhaps the term neglect will begin to be more clearly and universally defined. Can you tell me a little bit about the legislation that you are working on in Tennessee? There's legislation in the process here in Connecticut as well, and across the country, pockets that are looking at some pretty interesting new bills. What are you working on in Tennessee right now?
Okay, so over the years, for probably 10 years, I have tried to introduce or encourage legislation in different areas that impact child welfare reform. I have lots. I've listed, I think, like 12 different issues.
So, we have worked pretty hard on Family First Prevention Services Act legislation, which is beginning to trickle down around the country. Here in Connecticut, we are hearing public comments and the public messaging from our state's CPS agency, the Department of Children and Families, that we are becoming an agency in a state that's more about family preservation, that we are looking at the family first parameters and implementing them here in our state. It's being talked about, but it has not yet been put into practice. We don't have policies and procedures in place. And I'm wondering about the legislation that is being proposed across the country now in states, either in response to Family First or in response to the advocacy efforts of so many of our family forward advocates across the country. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So over the course of time that I've been trying to do reform work, I've really tried to look at different kinds of laws. A lot of time when you get a law to a state legislator, the first thing they do is they send it over to put a fiscal note on it. Okay. So I know at one point I asked for videos in the courtrooms and they come back and they like, oh, it's going to be too expensive. So this time and that's how they kill it immediately. They'll just like knock you off the docket. So this time I looked at what can we do? What's something that I can help introduce that would have a $0 attached to it, and that I could help them understand and design and work through the courts to make some improvement, and then make it measurable and have a goal, and then to get more legislative changes. So what I looked at is a family advocate. So I am asking the Tennessee legislature to introduce a family advocate into this system as soon as possible, to let a family know that they have a right to a family advocate. And this is intended to be, like I talked about at the beginning, these cases are so contentious, and it's such a contested and litigious playground that if you can get somebody who can step in and work with the family and try to remedy the conditions, help the family understand the lingo of the system, because a lot of times you don't even understand the language they're speaking. And this is attorneys who are representing the parents don't always have the time to do this. And it's a little bit different from actually preparing a case for trial. And they don't have a lot of the resources that are necessary. So I have a training program outlined with basically 16 modules that just will teach volunteer advocates, and these can be parent peers. They can be parents who have gone through the system already, or they can just be other people in the community who really have an interest and a heart for kind of wanting to adopt a family and sort of help the family through the process, so that they would understand the difference between a policy and a law, what the court system does, and then how to ask the right questions. I tell parents all the time, questions are your best line of defense. So when you hear no, you need to say why, or you need to say, what do I have to do to get past that? What do you expect of me? What am I supposed to do here? And because it's so chaotic and so confusing. So this is asking for a family advocate. And I'm hoping we have a $0 fiscal note on it. I've already outlined the program. I have a couple of people really interested in it. And it's a matter of saying, can we just take a look and try this? And I've told them, it's like, I really want to reduce foster care needs in Tennessee by 25%. It's really hard to get straight numbers from DCS, but one of the most recent number they articulated is 8,200 children in foster care. And so that would be looking at reducing foster care by, 12 to 1,500 children. And that would make an impact on the lives of thousands of people. And it would begin to set a trend for rehabilitating families and stabilizing families other than just removing children out of their homes.
So why do you think that that's an important piece? Obviously, it's obvious, right, that it's an important piece for families. Is it an important piece for our states? Is it an important piece for Tennessee?
Yeah, that's a good question too, because I don't know how much in any of your other productions you've talked about the funding issue, but people who are really want to know sort of how this child welfare system works, they need to understand the funding system. And the Title IV money for decades now has only provided the states money for family services if they take a child out of a home and put them in foster care. That is one of the qualifications. Plus, they have to be poor. Okay, so for the state to get their money from let me reset this, for the state to get our taxpayer dollars, which we're paying taxes to both the state and the federal government, but it's all our taxpayer dollars that is being spent. So for the state to get federal taxpayer dollars, they have to meet certain requirements. And that's if they have to remove children who are poor from their homes. And that's how the funding is set up. Now, the purpose of the Families First Act that passed in February 2018 was to be able to allow the states to reposition the use of that money so that they were using that money for services 12 months prior to removal, which is huge. This is huge. It's hard to do for several reasons. First, you have a huge bureaucracy. In Tennessee alone, 3,500 employees. That is a very sizable organization. And you have layers of supervisors, and you have people on the street working, you have high turnover, you have all of the things that in any other industry would make it difficult to be productive and efficient anyway. So now you have to change that mentality. The other force that you have working against this is the private contractors. And the private contractors have contracts for millions of dollars that require the removal of children and putting them in foster care. For instance, in Tennessee, Youth Villages has like an $85 million a year contract. Omnivisions has like a $65 million a year contract. These are huge numbers. And some of these on a national level, when you look at some of these foster care companies, they go across several states, such as Providence and Eckerd and some of the other Catholic charities. So it's huge as far as a bureaucratic organization that is slow to make changes. Plus, it's huge in that you have all these contractors that don't want things to change because it's going to be money out of their pocket. So that's the obstacles that we face.
So, these trends are really important for people to know about. I think it's important for our lawmakers to be a little more aware of how these trends, how the legislation impacts trends, what advocates are saying versus what our child welfare industry is saying about how effective our system currently is and what changes really need to be made. I think lawmakers really don't have all of the information that they need. And that's certainly one of the reasons why I think our podcast and some other efforts to bring awareness to these issues are so important. I want to thank you very much for being here today. Is there anything else you want to add that we haven't covered that you think our listeners should know about in terms of child welfare trends and the trauma impact on our kids and families today?
Well, separation is trauma. So we've got to understand, I mean, there are children who are suffering from trauma who need additional services, but who also need the connections to their families. But separation is trauma as well. So we need to really look at what are these agencies doing to maintain and stabilize homes with the millions of dollars that they are spending.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you, Connie, for joining us today. And thank you all for listening. In our next podcast, we're going to be talking about first responder encounter 101. We'll be talking about what happens when parents call 911 because their child's behaviors have become too unsafe, and what parents can do in advance to manage that experience in a way that supports the struggling child as well as the family as a whole. Um, Parenting Through Trauma is powered by Family Forward Advocacy Connecticut. Visit our website at familyforwardadvocacyct.com. Find us on Facebook. You can leave comments for us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Parenting Through Trauma. Thanks for listening today. Please share this episode with your contacts. Subscribe so we can grow our subscription base and encourage you to support us in any way that you can. Raising awareness about childhood trauma, trends in child welfare, and how child serving systems work or don't work is how change is made, and your voice can be a powerful tool. Uh, we'll see you again next time right here on Parenting Through Trauma. Thank you very much. Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.